Good evening, everyone. First of all, it's so lovely to see people in person here at this lecture. As you know, for the last couple of years, we've had to do it online, which is still very interesting and very good, and we're delighted to have Hannah, who was a speaker 2 years ago, back with us tonight. But it is so much better, I think you agree, to be here in person, and even if you have had to survive a bit of the weather. So thank you very much for coming. My name's Anne Landels. I'm very privileged to be the chair of Apex Scotland, and I've had that role for about 18 months now. So this is my first opportunity to speak to people in person at the annual lecture. First of all, I'd like to welcome you here on behalf of the board and also of all the staff of Apex. As I said, it's great. This is a really big occasion for us as an organisation, and it is so good to be back here, being able to see you and talk to you hopefully later on as well, in the less formal part of the evening. There are no fire alarms planned, you'll be delighted to know, given the weather, but if the fire alarm should go off, if you just follow the signs for the fire exit and down, there'll be people guiding you to a safe place. But as I say, there's nothing planned. This tonight also marks the launch of the Apex Scotland annual report, which is on our website, and you'll find some introductory pages on the annual report in your delegate packs. So it's got lots of information in it about what we do as an organisation, what we've achieved in the last year, and also some information about some of the new things that we've been doing. And I hope that you will have time to access it after tonight's event, and any questions or comments we'll be delighted to have back from you. So it's my pleasure to be able to introduce our guest speaker tonight, who is the Cabinet Secretary for Justice and Veterans, Keith Brown MSP. I'm very pleased that he's been able to find time to join us tonight. You'll find in your pack Keith's biography. I'm not going to read it, I'm sure you can read it yourselves, but he's actually had two roles that link very closely to the work that Apex Scotland does. He was the Cabinet Secretary for Economy, Jobs and Fair Work, and of course he is now the Cabinet Secretary for Justice and Veterans, a post that he's held since May 2021. So Keith is going to be answering questions after his talk, and I'm very delighted to hand over to him now, and welcome to you, Keith. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for the introduction and also for the invitation to come along tonight. I was just saying that the first job I had after graduation was in this building. It's actually a phenomenal building. When you come up the staircase, it actually goes down about 7 floors, so you can get out at Goulburn Street. And at that time, for those that know Mary King's Close, that wasn't open to the public. And the only way you could get to see it, which I did, was to speak to a guy in the planning department who inevitably was called Jimmy, and if you're in his good books you would get a tour of Mary King's Close, which is just a fascinating place to go if you haven't been. I should also say that this is a double pleasure for me to be here as Justice Secretary, because you never know how long you're going to last in politics, and I see tonight the Justice Secretary at Westminster has been sacked, so it's nice still to be in a job and to be here. You never know how long it will last. And I was thinking, looking at this, the one previous engagement before being involved at the Parliament with Apex that I had was in the 1990s, and I'd been elected in a by-election to local council, and there was an organisation, an arm's-length leisure company called Apex that the council was involved in, that were my kind of bête noire, and I used to regularly put out as a very keen candidate and then councillor damning press releases about Apex, to the point that somebody from this Apex phoned me up and said, if you don't stop talking about us in these ways, we're going to sue you. Genuinely happened, and I said, it's nothing to do with you, I didn't even know you existed at the time, but and said, I'm going to keep doing it anyway. But I have matured, perhaps you could say been rehabilitated in the meantime, so that was my first real involvement with Apex Scotland. But I would also want to congratulate Apex Scotland for bringing us all together. As been suggested, I have had one meeting in here, sort of post-COVID, a veterans event, but for many of us this will be the first time we've had the chance to meet face to face. And just to see the range of people from across the justice sector that are here as well, for me, having got this job last year and having had so few opportunities to meet people across the sector, it's a real pleasure to be here tonight. So thanks for that, and also thank you too to Apex for your continued work in reducing reoffending, helping to highlight and respond to the issues that bring people into contact with our justice system. And these are the themes that I intend to cover tonight, if I can, in our discussion, and I'm sure we'll get further into them in the Q&A. In addressing the subject of today's event, so making justice work for everyone, I think one thing is certain, we're going to have to continue to have these conversations and to work together just as we have in responding to the extraordinary impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the justice system. And that had a profound effect. I mean, I see Eric McQueen here. The effect on the court service was huge, and the response was, I think, fantastic. The innovation, the adaptability of public services in general, but justice services has been remarkable as well. What we did in the Scottish Government was to respond with significant investments towards dealing with the pandemic, but also now dealing with recovery, renewal and transformation. And that's included an additional £50 million in the current and previous financial years to help to increase the capacity across the justice system and to help, in particular, enable the criminal courts to address the inevitable backlogs that built up during the pandemic. Now, all the justice agencies that I've spoken to are clear that the recovery programme will take several years to address. That's no less true of the court system as well. But they are committed to working in partnership with the government to help address those challenges head on, and progress is being made. So, again, I want to thank all the justice agencies represented here tonight for the assistance that you've given in keeping things moving. I think there were a number of obvious heroes during the pandemic. We all clapped for carers and the NHS, but many of our colleagues in local government, my bins were collected every single week, as they normally are. Many services continue to run on a fraction of the staff that you could normally call upon, and that's no less true of the justice sector as well. And I know there were exceptional challenges as any public-facing service would have, and that was responded to with a great sense of duty and collaboration. So, in addition to the significant funding that we provided as a government, we've also supported recovery throughout the pandemic through legislation. In June, the Scottish Parliament passed the Coronavirus Recovery and Reform Act, and that Act continued the extension of a range of temporary justice measures that were introduced during the pandemic and that remain critical to help mitigate the impact of the backlog and to ensure cases can progress. Now, it's an easy thing to say. We had very substantial or significant political opposition to the continuation of some of those measures, but we listened to the justice agencies, which were telling us that in some cases these had to continue if there was to be progress against the backlog. And I think, to my surprise, that's been one thing that's been difficult to get across to some opposition parties, that the pandemic was here and we all knew it was here, but its effects last a long time afterwards, and you have to follow through to make sure you deal with the backlogs which have been created. And one of the things which happened, of course, was a more digitalised, if you like, justice sector. And I think that's one of the things which we've done which can lead to potentially longer-term improvements within the system. And actually some of the people, the Lord President, the forward-looking nature of the approach that they took, I think, has been quite remarkable. But those changes which we made, some of them can be long-term improvements to the system, and the system we're trying to move towards is a transformed system which is person-centred and trauma-informed. Now, I've said a number of times now, trauma-informed is something that people talk about all the time in all sorts of different sectors, but it really is to be a trauma-responsive justice system that we're looking for. I think we had a meeting of the Victims Task Force, and we agreed at that point that we had to have right across, and it's not a system because there's so many different parts of the justice sector, if you like, so perhaps can't be described as a system, but right the way across it, all the different agencies had to have that training in trauma-informed training, and the obvious point being, of course, that ministers have to do it as well. So mine, actually, I think is next week. I'll have my training, not that that's the be-all and end-all of it, but we all should be ready to respond in a way. So many people that come, as you'll know better than me, in contact with the justice system have suffered trauma either in the past or more recently. So it's that kind of reform and a focus on efficient and effective public services that I, for my part, am keen to see continue. And I look forward to considering how we can try and embed some of those measures permanently, where we can make a case for that. One, for example, will be on the release of prisoners. Again, bitterly opposed by some in the Parliament. But why should that not be in the statute book in Scotland, so that we can respond in future to an emergency? And why is it not acceptable to do it in Scotland when it's on the statute book in London? It's just a common sense thing. If you have to, for public health or other reasons, have a release of prisoners, you should have that ability to do it without having to go through all sorts of other processes, which you might not have the time to do in the case of an emergency. So there are a number of things which we can embed in the system, which we've innovated to achieve over the course of the last couple of years, and technology is a big part of that. Although we always have to do that, making sure that we safeguard the key principles of our justice system. And we have the chance tonight to discuss making justice work for everyone, exploring where we can make changes, and also celebrate the successes, something we're never that great at doing in Scotland in many areas, many of the successes across our justice sector. And that's really the spirit on which the Scottish Government's justice vision is built upon, or seeks to be built upon. But before we delve too much into the ambitions, I want to recognise that the discussions that we have tonight, and some of the discussions bilaterally which you'll have had, the organisations that you represent with the government and others, are taking place against a really challenging backdrop. So earlier today, Parliament's been really busy with the programme for government which the government has announced. And it's against the background of economic upheaval. And just to give you a couple of points, the First Minister made it clear today that last year when we had our budget settlement, and we, like local authorities to some extent, are get told what we're getting from Westminster, which represented around a 2% cut when you stripped out the COVID consequentials. Around a 2% cut. Since that time, or at that time, inflation was at 2%. In February it was 6%. It's now about 10%. Some economic commentators say it will be 22%. So if you have a budget which is down at the start, and then you have to find, whether it's for police or other aspects of the justice sector, local government employees, wage increases of 5–10%, then you can tell there's real pressure on the budget. And the simple fact will be, some of the things that we wanted to do, we now cannot do, unless, of course, there's an element to what is announced at Westminster, perhaps over the next couple of days, which recognises that public authorities, as well as individuals, domestic energy users and businesses, public authorities have to be supported here as well. It's true for our prisons, for our police stations, for all sorts of offices and facilities that we have. They're also having to pay more in terms of their energy costs. And the government, in our part, we have to support third sector and other organisations who are also struggling with this. So I would hope that will be recognised, but it's a very challenging backdrop. And of course, the economic upheaval that we've seen both through COVID and now through this energy crisis is not something I think we've seen for a generation. I mean, I do remember the early 1980s, mid-1970s, and the economic upheavals we had then, but this seems to be something quite different. Without being a bit too downbeat about it, I think, in my view, not the government's view, but I think the UK is going through a multi-generational slide in living standards. I think that's happening right now and is continuing. So I think the feature of the 70s and 80s was major constraints on public expenditure, and that's also a challenge that we have. So we do have challenges, and that's true for all of us here, for individuals, businesses and public services. As a responsible government, we are determined to act to mitigate the impact of the crisis where we can, to protect livelihoods and lives in Scotland in the coming winter, and to do as much as we can as we weather the coming storm to work for and secure a better, sustainable future for people and their families. And that's obviously through this difficult period, but also in years to come. And if you look at some of those pay deals that have been struck, they have been, wherever we've been able to get that agreement, featured what the biased towards the lowest paid, which is as it should be. Those are the ones that will struggle the most to do that. And if you think back to 2009, when we had the big financial crash, what the Scottish Government did this, and that's the first time I entered government, was to have a deal, a social contract, if you like, which said we will have a policy of no compulsory redundancies. And the reason for that was twofold. One, to give people that security, and they needed to have that security. But secondly, the nature of that crisis was different. It was a financial one. People would simply have stopped spending if their jobs are in jeopardy. But if you tell people your job is secure, they're more likely to spend and help the economy come through that process. This is a different crisis today. Some of the things we've announced are guaranteeing people will not lose their house. In banning evictions, for example, and also a rent freeze if people are renting their houses. So we'll do what we can to try and protect individuals. And the programme for government announced today takes into account ways in which we can mitigate the crisis, but we don't have control over the big energy levers. Some scandalous ways in which the energy market has been mismanaged in this country. People producing energy through renewables or nuclear. I don't know if anybody saw the Panorama programme last night, a fantastic programme for explaining what's going on. So people that are providing energy through renewables or nuclear, they've had no increase to their costs, but they've had a fourfold increase in their profits. Whether it's the energy levers of power or whether it's the major huge expenditure which has been talked about, it will have to be the Westminster Government that deals with that. I just hope that public services are not forgotten in all of that. And it's really important, given that context, for me as Cabinet Secretary to be clear on the priorities and actions which I have and which I intend that we should work together on in the justice sector. But I and the Government is committed to making Scotland a fair and resilient place by the actions that we take. And I think the past 2 years have shown how resilient we can be, and also how innovative we can be in the ways we've tried to strengthen and modernise our justice system. So over the coming year, we'll progress major reforms in the justice system through consultation on, first of all, Baroness Helena Kennedy's recommendations for offences related to misogynistic conduct, which again will be certainly, if not world-leading, certainly way ahead of any other jurisdiction in the UK and I think large chunks of Europe. It will also continue the reform of bail and remand, introduce a criminal justice reform bill that will propose the end of the not proven verdict, and that's no small thing. It's been there for centuries. It's interesting having to go through the consultation, and as I'm going through it, having completely changed my mind from the last time it was discussed in the Parliament to thinking, why have we got a verdict which certainly those that come into contact with it, whether it's victims or others, don't understand the not proven verdict. But more than that, they're not allowed to have it explained to them by the court what the difference is between not proven and not guilty. If there's something that cannot be explained to people, then there's got to be a big question mark of it. So we are now committed to the abolition of the not proven verdict, which many of you here will immediately realise brings into consideration other consequential potential changes to the system, given that those that were keenest to retain it felt it to be a safeguard, and they are looking to have other safeguards which might be incorporated. So we'll say more about that in due course, but we have announced we will abolish the not proven verdict. We'll also take forward reforms through legislation on police complaints and misconduct handling and legal services, the regulation of legal services. We'll also have the Care and Justice Bill for children, which will improve the experience of children who have to engage with the justice and the care systems. And we'll also consult on legislative provisions to modernise justice processes, including, as I've mentioned, greater use of digital processes. And I'm keen to hear the reflections and the debate that we have as we process these reforms. And I hope that we can come away, at least from tonight's session, with a renewed impetus to continue to make a real difference to the delivery of justice and indeed to the lives of people across the country. I've mentioned already the Vision for Justice, which was published actually in February this year, and that sets out what I think is a transformative vision of the future justice system for Scotland, and it spans the full journey of criminal, civil and administrative justice, which are represented here tonight. So we are striving, what was the bottom line? We're striving for a Scotland where we're all able to exercise our human and civic rights, where we all have fair access to justice, and where our laws and processes of justice meet our needs and provide us with a sense of security which is central to our everyday lives. A Scotland where we tackle deep-rooted societal issues and where that, in turn, leads to further reductions in crime and unintentional harm in our communities. And also a Scotland where we'll be treated as a person first and foremost, where people affected by crime are heard and fully supported, and where people who commit offences are appropriately sentenced and supported in their rehabilitation by the most effective means possible. I'm surprised why those sentences are still so contentious in the Scottish Parliament, but honestly, when I say things like that and then I see the coverage in the Mail and the Express and the Sun, you would think the obvious point, this is smart justice. It just seems to be that divide where we continually are badgered to put more and more people to prison, regardless of the effect on them, regardless on the consequences for recidivism, rather than trying to get people through and changed as part of that process, the process of rehabilitation. One of the heartening things I found taking the job on last year was prison officers. The amount of feedback we had from prison officers who, because they'd released a number of prisoners and because of the slower pace, admittedly through almost enforced kind of isolation of some prisoners because of the COVID situation, felt it was the rewarding job they actually joined up for. They were spending more time with individual prisoners and they felt making a real difference because of that space. Whereas if you're up 8,000 people plus in terms of our prison population, that time was not there to do that. But that's what the prison service should be doing. So, and I'm sure that vision of a Scotland's justice system is one that we can all subscribe to. And we have to, of course, at the root of that, work on the causes of offending and reoffending, support individuals and transform the experience of Scotland's justice system. One of the examples I've given was a guy who I've been talking with whose son was murdered, and he went to the court and ended up sitting right next to the person that was accused of murdering his son. So even for people that come into the justice system, if you like, tangentially in that way, I think we have to think about how everybody experiences the justice system. And we can do that best by ensuring the justice services, the third sector partners, the legal profession are also person-centred and trauma-informed. And we are trying to work to shift the balance between the use of custody and justice in the community, following the evidence on what reduces reoffending and supports people in securing better outcomes. So our services, including those delivered by our third sector partners, should also be person-centred and trauma-informed, and that's not a criticism. Many of them will be, but I think that's the aim that we have to have. And that really means that all justice services have to ensure that a person's individual needs and values are respected, and that everyone is treated with empathy and kindness and provided with the support they need. Right down to the point that if you're in prison, you should be getting the same standards of healthcare as anybody else in society. And that priority recognises that many of the issues that bring people into contact with the justice system themselves are traumatic instances. And of course, on top of that, being imprisoned or having a parent imprisoned itself is an adverse childhood experience or a traumatic experience in its own right. So in my view, I'm resolute that the justice system should be a healing system and not one that re-traumatises everybody. And people also have to trust and understand justice outcomes. When we recently held a public consultation on the not proven verdict, many of the respondents made clear that they do not have trust in a verdict, for example, that can't, as I've said, be adequately explained to them and is understood differently by different jurors. Because I think it's also true to say, and I'm sure people will correct me if I'm wrong, that the sheriff or judge is not allowed to explain to the jury either the nature of a not proven verdict, such as the contention around it. I've also met personally with survivors and families who've told me of the trauma the verdict itself can cause, and the individuals. It's also potentially the case that somebody found not proven finds that extremely unsatisfactory for their own reasons. So as I say, today we have said we'll bring forward legislation within the parliamentary year to abolish that verdict and take forward accompanying reforms. And also that bill, the Criminal Justice Bill, will bring forward legislative reforms that build on the recommendations of Lady Dorian's review on improving the management of sexual offence cases, including creating the statutory right to anonymity for complainers in sexual offence cases, a point that Scotland seems to be some way behind other jurisdictions on. And we'll also look to develop, as part of that bill, a package of reforms that will bring meaningful and lasting improvements to the way in which sexual offence cases are managed, and we want to continue to engage extensively on these issues with justice partners and the public. And both through improving the victims' experience of the justice system consultation and in the review governance group that we've set up for Lady Dorian's recommendations, we've also sought views on the range of proposals set out in that review. And that includes things like the creation of a specialist sexual offences court, and again there are arguments on both sides which I'm more than happy to listen to. The introduction of independent legal representation for complainers, and again there are arguments, others in the Parliament that see some issues in relation to that. So looking forward to the contributions of all those who have responded to the consultation. And that includes people like Rape Crisis Scotland and Victim Support Scotland, amongst others, who have made a significant contribution to the discussion so far. And I think transforming how justice delivers for women and children in our society is fundamental to making justice work for everybody. So each action the government takes comes with the recognition of the fundamental importance of hearing the voices of people affected by crime across the justice system, and that is vital. And as part of that process, myself and the Lord Advocate lead a victims task force. We co-chair it, work with partners to ensure that policy and practice is fully informed by the voices of victims and witnesses. And to make sure that happens, we've created a process, the whole task force has created a process where one meeting, that's all the Lord Advocate and I will do. We'll listen to the voices of victims, sometimes not even mediated by the organisations which represent their interests, but directly from the victims themselves. And that commitment includes also an investment of £48 million over the next 3 years in our victim-centred approach fund. We are supporting 23 third sector victim support organisations through that fund, which enables them to provide practical and emotional support to people affected by crime across Scotland. And I've seen at first hand the work that is done in this area by organisations, most frequently by Visitors Victims Support Scotland, but many other organisations as well. But there is more that we can do, and we'll take forward the outcomes of the consultation as well on the introduction of a Victims Commissioner for Scotland. I had a very good discussion with the Victims Commissioner at Westminster. She was very keen to say what would work and what would not work in her view. But that would ensure that victims had an independent figurehead to represent their views and champion their causes, and that policy and practice, whether in government or in other areas, is considered and monitored from that victim's perspective. Alongside other actions, we want to commission an independent review of the victim notification scheme. Demonstrates, I think, our commitment to improve the experiences of victims and witnesses in the justice system. And we're building on the work already underway in these areas, but it should be more than iterative change. We should be looking where we need to make a step change to properly consider the individuals at the heart of the justice services. So you and the workforces that you all represent are crucial in this. And we in government have the responsibility to provide you with the support and the opportunities to deliver services in a different and more person-centred way where that has to happen. Hugely relevant to this work, I should say, is the current considerations of our Women in Justice Leadership Panel, which is chaired by Ash Regan, the Community Safety Minister. And that panel is actively looking at how we address gender inequality and improve women's experiences within the justice system. Equally importantly is the voice of lived experience, and the fact that that should be a fundamental aspect of our vision, and it should also help inform the decisions that can have an impact on people's lives. So trying to make justice work for everyone. And also, I think, as I've come to realise over recent months, justice, you can have the narrow view of many people who have not experienced it before, but it is much more than a verdict or a court process. Justice has got a much broader meaning for many people, and whether they feel at the end of it, whichever way they've come into contact, that they've got faith in it is really important, and also that they're not traumatised by it. I mentioned already, though, the prevention and the early intervention of crime and harm and reducing reoffending. And we have to strive to work across the public services to improve outcomes. The big example in that, of course, is the Violence Reduction Unit and the work that it's done by taking a public health approach, now copied by authorities in London and elsewhere, but had made a huge impact. Worth also saying that we have had the crime figures out recently, and they show crime at a lower level than at any time since records began in 1974. They show that we have more police officers per capita than the rest of the UK. We have a constable starts on around £5,000 more a year here in Scotland. The chances of you suffering a crime in 2007, I think it was, were 1 in 5. It's now 1 in 8. But you would not believe that we live in a relatively safe society if you looked at the pages of some of our newspapers every day, which really, I think, just are designed to try and pull down our justice system. So although I'm talking an awful lot about the innovations and the improvements we have to make, I'm not at all blind to the virtues of the system and the work that's done within the system, and the work that's been done to get crime down to the level that it's currently at. But of course there is always more to do. And we've, I think, tried to demonstrate our commitment to holistic approaches to prevention through implementing the promise, for example, and most recently in considering the recommendations of the Drugs Death Task Force report. And this work is not easy. It will require a concentrated effort on all our parts. But it affects all of us, and it's ultimately only by addressing the causes of crime that will make lasting change. And prevention requires, in my view, a two-pronged approach via primary prevention and secondary means. In other words, supporting people to avoid offending behaviours in the first instance, and also supporting those who have offended to break the cycle of high-risk behaviours. And for both ambitions, we have to follow the evidence on what works to reduce crime and harm. And I know I'm harping on about it a bit, but constantly to be told, I don't know what interest I'm meant to have in freeing dangerous people or you know, releasing people into the community, or the various other things which, you know, the prison population, for example. We have a higher prison population than virtually anywhere in certainly Europe. And I noticed recently, I looked at this last year when I first got this job, if you look at places like even Texas, the bicameral state legislature, which is totally dominated not just by Republicans, but some substantially right-wing Republicans, they had a vote to slash their prison population. Many of them were for drugs-related offences. And California did the same, Georgia did the same, because it's not sustainable, it doesn't work. There are people in prison that should not be in prison. They're not going to be changed, their behaviour is not going to be changed by the environment that prison provides for them, unless you do additional things. So, to me, this seems to be, if not axiomatic, it's certainly obvious that you're going to have to do these kind of things if you want to change people's behaviour. And it seems to me that there is a huge body of a consensus, not on everything around that, but generally on that, possibly in this room, I don't know, but behind that idea of making prison a more limited experience across society and making it more productive. And yet the debate is never a balanced one. It's always the one side, you know, put them in jail, lock them up for longer sentences, specific crimes for this, sentences for this, specific offences for that. And I'm sure there's a role for much of that, but it doesn't seem sometimes a very balanced debate. So along with my Cabinet colleagues, we are committed to making not only justice, but obviously all public services work for everybody. And how we treat people who come into contact with the criminal justice system, I think says a lot about the kind of society that we are. I forget who it was that said it, and people here will probably know, but whoever said you can judge a society by the state of their prisons and the way their prisoners are treated. It's a very true point. I mean, I often get the idea that there's no votes in prisons. Well, actually there is these days, but that's not the point. The point is it's what it says about you as a society. I remember having discussions when I was younger with my family arguing against capital punishment. And I said, it's not really, to some extent, about the person that's been punished. It's about what it says about you as a society if society takes somebody's life. So I think the same is true in relation to prisons. The way that you treat people in prison, it's what it says about you as a society. And it's always going to be necessary for those, of course, who pose a risk of serious harm. We know that imprisonment damages the connections that prevent people from offending or re-offending, such as family relationships, employment and access to housing. And that is no less true of remand than it is of people who have been sentenced. Remand can be so disruptive to people's lives. So the Howard League today having a go at the government and others, making the point that remand can be so disruptive of family relationships, of people's employment, and so much, and that's one reason why we're taking forward the bail and release bill. And we also know that short-term imprisonment in particular is not effective in addressing the underlying causes of offending. We know that people who are in contact with the justice system have usually already experienced severe and multiple disadvantage, including homelessness, substance misuse and domestic violence or abuse. I've had a lot of proposals put to me about ways that we can improve the experience of women in custody, all of which I've supported. And each one's come up and said, and what is it about this that we shouldn't do for the 96% of the population in prison who are men? Because they seem to me to be sensible things to do. And one thing was pointed out to me, I think it was something like between 70 and 90, I can't remember the exact figure, of women in prison have had head injuries previously. As I say, people that have ended up in the justice system have usually ended up after having had traumatic experiences themselves. In fact, individuals from the 10% most deprived areas are overrepresented in prison arrivals by a factor of 3. And I think we all know that care experienced people are also disproportionately represented within the prison population, around a quarter of the prison population reporting being in care as a child. And it also, of course, when an individual is imprisoned, has a wider impact. So 27,000 children who are affected by parental imprisonment each year in Scotland. Although I did listen to a really good Radio 4 discussion with this woman, who I think was Scottish, but had been a barrister in London. And it was mainly, but not exclusively, about women, but basically about the experience of children whose parents have been imprisoned. And actually in Scotland, a child in that circumstance will be guaranteed a house, they'll be guaranteed a place in a school, and down south you're not guaranteed those things, which just exacerbates that stigma which is there. So just to say, there are some things which we're obviously getting right in relation to that. And parental imprisonment is recognised as an adverse childhood experience, obviously, and known to significantly impact long-term health and well-being and negatively affect both attainment in school and later life experiences. And these are people that are completely innocent of causing any offence. And as I've already said, imprisonment's got a clear role in protecting the public, but it shouldn't be the answer to addressing wider social harms. We can collectively do better. We need to ask ourselves hard questions about the role of custody now and in the future in a modern, progressive Scotland. And if we want to see reductions in reoffending and victimisation, along with associated reductions in damage to people and communities, there needs to be a decisive shift away from the use of custody, including for remand, and towards community-based interventions, which in any event have low rates of recidivism. There is a smart, compassionate justice that emphasises the need to protect victims, ensure public safety, and give those who have offended the support they need to make different choices, so that they can make a positive contribution to our communities. I remember in a previous ministerial role, it was an education one, I did want to do a study at the time on the prison population and the numbers within that who had learning difficulties, whether it was dyslexia undiagnosed, because I had the view, not required any particular insight on my part, that if you're at school and you start to fade behind, or you lag behind your studies because you've got an undiagnosed condition, which, let's face it, in the 70s, 80s and 90s is quite prevalent, and then that could then lead on to other behaviours which could help explain to you why you're sitting in prison and you're unaware of that situation. My daughter did a law degree, and it wasn't until she was in her 3rd year that they diagnosed her dyslexia and got her a computer which helped her out. So if you're somebody, it could be the case you can explain partially at least some of your behaviours which have led ultimately to prison because of undiagnosed learning difficulties. So that seems to me to be, a smart and compassionate justice system that would look to try and understand that. We have published a national strategy for community justice that sets out the national direction for community justice by building on the progress that's been made to date, and also emphasising our long-standing aims to encourage that person-centred, trauma-informed, rehabilitative approach. It also recognises the point that while public protection is paramount, that's entirely consistent with widening the use of community-based interventions and sentences, which can be more effective in reducing reoffending and assisting with rehabilitation. I only got a chance to see, I think, one example. It was in Falkirk during the pandemic, and the difference it made to the people admittedly a small number of people that were working in a community garden rather than being in prison. You could see one guy, long after he'd served all the hours he had to serve, was still going back all the time. He got an affirmation and a status he felt from that which he hadn't had in his life before. And that would not have happened, I would say, if he was in custody. So we have to recognise that the public protection, of course, is paramount, but rehabilitation is absolutely essential. And underneath the high-level ambitions that we have, the strategy for community justice has a sharp focus on identifying specific areas for improvement. I think people here would concede the point, I would hope, that it's at best uneven across the country, such that sheriffs are often reluctant to have a community justice disposal because they don't have the required confidence in that. So I think there's more work that we have to do. And the strategy also sets out a number of national aims and priority actions, both for the Scottish Government and for partners to take forward. And they focus on diversion and early intervention, as you'd expect, and the provision of robust and high-quality interventions, responsive services, which meet the needs of individuals and strong leadership and partnership working. It requires also, I think, political leadership, because saying you're spending money on these things, in particular somebody's committed an offence, particularly if it's a all offences can be controversial, but there can be a response to that, which is why you spend the money doing this. Now, leaving aside the individual that's having the money spent on, it's for society's benefit, it's for everyone's benefit. If we have somebody that's rehabilitated, that stops more crimes, it stops more victims. You would think that would be quite an obvious merit of trying to do that. So in order to drive implementation of this at both a national and local level, we're committed to working with partners to develop and publish a detailed delivery plan, and that will contain more tangible time-limited actions detailing how various parts of the strategy will be progressed. And to further support a shift from custody to community interventions, we've also recently introduced legislation which seeks to refocus how imprisonment is used. I've mentioned the Bail and Release from Custody Bill, which proposes reforms to bail law so people are only remanded in custody if they pose that serious risk of serious harm to other people, or in certain cases through the delivery of justice, say there was a genuine fear on the part of the court of jury tampering or witness intimidation, for example. But it also proposes changes to certain prison release mechanisms with an emphasis on providing more opportunities for reintegration and support for those released from custody. And both the strategy and the bill recognise that the system alone cannot achieve the improvements that we're all seeking. The message that we've received again and again is that individuals in contact with the criminal justice system are also receiving support from mental health services, addiction services, housing and more agencies, and work to ensure joined-up consistent provision of those different services is crucial, and that it's sustained. Perhaps comes in earlier, prior to release, and it continues for longer afterwards. I think you'll all be aware of individuals, certainly I am through working with the WISE group, of people who have come out genuinely committed to getting over their addiction and also not reoffending, and then a few bad things happen, something falls through, a house, a partnership, and they end up in a pub. This one guy in particular, Friday evening, and that's when it all started again. So we have to make sure, and we also have to educate the public to say there's a reason why we're spending this money on providing these services, and it is for society's benefit. So it does take that kind of shift towards greater use of community-based interventions, and it will require resources. And we have continued to increase investment in community justice over recent years, including targeted funding to support the development of services such as bail supervision and structured deferred sentences, and to aid recovery from the COVID pandemic. But there are, as I started off by saying, really challenging times ahead. Going back to when I first started here in 1988, at that time we were saying how difficult the budget was that year. We've been saying it every single year in local government since then. I was in local government for 19 years. I've never known this kind of experience. The truth of it started in the mid-1970s with having to get in touch with the IMF, a major squeeze on public expenditure, but we are back in that kind of territory right now, which makes all of this even more challenging because of the pressure on budgets. We have to, because of that, ensure positive outcomes for people in our communities is a subject or the result of collaborative approaches and a continued effort to reach across organisational boundaries. As I've already highlighted, the third sector plays an absolutely critical role in this, and they often have particular skills in helping the people they work with navigate through statutory services, and I've seen that firsthand, the difference the third sector can make to the lives of people they work with, whether that's supporting people on a community order so they can successfully complete it, or mentoring someone following their release from prison, walking beside them as they rebuild their lives and make positive connections in their communities, or just providing emotional and practical support to victims and survivors of crime. And for those of you involved directly in providing these services, I would just want to say on behalf of the government, thank you for doing what you do. You are demonstrating often the life-changing impact that person-centred, trauma-informed, and know they can seem like buzzwords, that kind of support can have. And you will probably all have particular instances where you just had that point where you've seen the difference that you've made to somebody's life, and it's trying to keep hold of that, I think, is the really important thing. So just to conclude, I am certain that if we can take these actions together, amongst the many others that the wider Scottish Government and partners will take, we can make a significant difference towards strengthening and modernising our justice system. And if you think back to people like Niven Rennie and the people that started off with the Violence Reduction Unit, that big change from saying we're not approaching this from a justice or policing point of view, we're doing it from a public health point of view, how scary that would have been at that journey, but how right they were to have done it that way. I think we're at a similar point here with the changes we want to make to the justice system. I know it's not straightforward, I'm not trying to pretend that it is. I know there are many challenges and the budget is just one of those. And I know that many will be facing these challenges on a daily basis. And I'd just like to reinforce in closing the commitment that we have to listen to what you have to say. We'll shortly test that in a minute or two with the Q&A. Our commitment to action, I've mentioned the things that we're doing in the programme for government, and our commitment to working collaboratively as we strive to transform the justice system to meet the needs of people in today's society in Scotland. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for that very interesting and thought-provoking lecture. We now have some time for questions, and I'm going to hand over to Alan Staff, our Chief Executive Officer, who's going to chair the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. We're going to take about 15 minutes for questions. So there will be a roving mic around. If you have a question, can you please just raise your hand, and when the mic gets to you, just introduce yourself and give your question. And can I remind you, people, that if you're relatively brief with your question, then we can cover a range of issues. If you're a bit long in your question, then it reduces the value of this time. So over to you.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I think you're absolutely right. Scotland are making the right steps in the right direction. I do wonder, are we being brave enough? I think we're introducing really good things, and the question I would like to ask you is there going to be accountability or responsibility put in place for these things? So you'd mentioned things like remand, and we still know that the numbers of young people in remand are still extremely high. We're introducing human rights into youth justice for the first ever time. Where does the responsibility sit for that? And quality of service is a massive thing across local authorities and across, for example, community justice. So I think one of the things that we're missing in Scotland is levels of accountability or responsibility for these things. Is that something that we're going to be looking at or introducing?
I'd probably like to have a bit of a further discussion to find out what you mean, or where that responsibility or accountability could be improved. I'm sure it could be. I think you mentioned, for example, more people, young people on remand. That has come down very substantially. We have very few young people now left in any kind of custody at all. Well, either in the Young Offenders Institute or a prison. I think it's down to about a dozen from, I think, a few years back. You're talking about 800 or 900, I think. I could be getting those figures wrong, they could be connected, but I think there's been huge efforts to reduce that the vast bulk that are in custody still are on remand. I would concede that point. There's only 1 or 2 that are there that are sentenced, and it's the courts that sentence them. We can't do anything about that at this stage until we bring forward this further bill. And just to say, I think, say for example, community justice, so this year we put a further £3.2 million in a pretty constrained budget to try and make sure, and it was actually done in a very, I think, elegant way by the civil service to make sure you weren't punishing those authorities who'd spent on it already, but you were encouraging those to spend some money on it. So I think our focus has been much more on trying to improve, if you like, the offer to the court system to make greater use of it. But I'm probably not long enough in the job to know what you mean by the gaps in accountability. We have to take responsibility. And just the last point I would say, in terms of the human rights side of it, I am really encouraged by what I found in this job. The police in particular, every speech the Chief Constable gives, and I see the actions that follow up, talks about the police being a human rights based organisation. What I'm very worried about is the definition of human rights the UK government seems to be willing to go with. They're looking to, I think, probably escape from the ECHR and this new Bill of Rights, which is a bill of reduction of rights, as far as I can see, is a real threat. We've opposed it. We said we don't want to do it. The Scottish Parliament, in its very creation, was bound to abide by human rights. So our commitment is there to do that, and I would be interested in any suggestions you've got as to ways in which you think we could improve accountability or responsibility in the system. And if we don't get a chance to discuss it tonight, please feel free to write and pass that on.
Hello, thanks for that really good talk. My name is Barbara Orton and I'm part of a group called Justice Watch, which pre-COVID, pre the pandemic, actually undertook a mass observation survey around the Scottish courts to observe how women were being treated. And at the end of it, there was a report written, and also we thought at the end of it, like, there must be something better than this. So in the end, you know, what we've continued working, and we've kind of discovered that in the end, like, why are women going to prison? There's still the same amount of same numbers of women in prison that there was about 20 years ago. In fact, it's doubling now, and it's women that shouldn't be there. I mean, you've been talking about all the statistics, and you know, couldn't agree more with all of that. And we're talking about this is despite all the initiatives and despite all the evidence that says, you know, that for the 80% of women committing low-level crime, it doesn't work. So I'm coming to the question. Sorry. So you've been talking about you wanting to see radical solutions. So we think we've come up with a radical solution, and it's for a women's community court that is in line with existing policy, which supports existing policy, which is in line with the current initiatives, the new initiatives around courts, which is actually cheaper as far as we've researched than any other of the initiatives, which also is trauma responsive, informed or whatever. And when you say person-centred, we mean i.e. women-centred, gender sensitive, and the question is for us is, would you like to know more about it? Because we've done it in collaboration with loads and loads of criminal justice organisations, you know, from women involved in the system itself to the people who make policy. And it's taken, you know, I think we've been working for quite, you know, since COVID. Anyway, so would you like to hear more about it? Would you like to meet us? And we can talk more about it. It's a simple model. But it's based on, we discovered that it was sheriffs that were sending women to prison, and for very, very laudable reasons, but in our model it takes sheriffs out of the equation in quite ingenious ways, and we hope will stop women going to prison. And we've been trying to present it in various forums to the Scottish Government, to various committees or groups or officials, and I think we've just started doing that, and I think we're in a bit of a situation where the situation is we're being passed from pillar to post. So we'd like to see see if we can get out of that and make progress. And would love to meet you. And I think you can't not meet us now, can you, after I've managed to get all that out? I hope.
Yes, I would say first off, and this is a classic, or may appear to be a classic passing of the buck, but we have a couple of people here in the audience, Kat Dalrymple and Neil Rennick, who are the senior officials in the Scottish Government in relation to that. It would tend to be the case they would have first go and they would produce a submission to me to look at. More than happy to look at it. I would just say that what we've got more bills going through the Scottish Parliament than any other portfolio, I forget the latest figure, so it's a really congested legislative programme, but some of the stuff we're doing just now is around the possibility of, for example, I mentioned a specialist sexual offences court, which disproportionately affects women, but also aware of the fact that the backlog that we have currently disproportionately affects women and girls because the preponderance of sexual offences cases, for example, and also the work that we're doing just now, and going back to your point about custody, and we can't and never should be able to decide who goes to jail and who doesn't in government. That should be for the court system. We are concentrating very much on the experience of custody. So the two new centres and the further ones that will happen, the Lilius one is the first one in Glasgow, a totally different environment for women, certain women at certain stages of their sentence, but very different, trying to make sure the life skills are there for life after prison as well, and to reflect what I mentioned before about the prevalence of victims of domestic violence that are women in prison as well. So we are tackling it from different points of view, but I am more than willing to hear different views. We have, for example, a suggestion from Lady Dorian that we have juryless trials, which is extremely contentious, especially with legal professions. So if we are willing to consider that, and it's because it's part of the consultation, even her review group split on that issue, I would hope that would demonstrate the extent to which we are willing to listen to new ideas. So I would say that if Neil or Kat can make themselves known to you, and if you have the meeting with them first, then I'm more than happy to meet, to find out what's going on in terms of the proposal and to meet afterwards.
Yeah, it's actually backed by Angelini and Kennedy as well. We've done our work.
Yeah.
Nice.
It's too dark, isn't it?
I'm David Manson. I'm a Justice of the Peace with Edinburgh Sheriff and JP Court. I just wondered if I could have a quick word on behalf of the Justice of the Peace Courts. I think they've been around for about, not the courts, but the JPs have been around for more than 400 years. And as you probably know, we give our services free and we undergo training in our own time to obviously be able to undertake our duties. But we have a major problem, certainly in Edinburgh, and I can't believe it's confined to Edinburgh. And it's really the fact that although we undergo legal training on an intensive basis now for 25 years, we are totally dependent on our legal advisors to give us legal advice and to keep us right. Now, at the moment, that we have a major problem in relation to the fact that we can't retain staff. And the reason for that, and perhaps you be kind enough to speak to your civil servants after this, is because they need regraded, and I don't have time to beat around the bush. That's the problem. And we have something like 6 legal advisors, and at any one time we've maybe only got 2 or 3 available to us. So courts have to be cancelled. All sorts of court business gets put off and people don't get the service that they need when they are there because they're under so much pressure. And I normally wouldn't talk about this, but it's just so important. And I think it's something that needs looked at. We've had a senior legal advisor who's been, the post's been vacant for 18 months, and we've been told that we're now going to get one at Christmas, but that was the only applicant. The previous time there were no applicants, so I hope that gives you some idea of the seriousness of the case. But you know, we have the possibility of dispensing justice all the time, every day. Today we were supposed to have 2 courts on. One of them had to be cancelled because we didn't have a legal advisor, and that's not unusual, and that can't be doing justice good. We've got many disposals that we can use, and we have the ability, even at this level, at the start of people's criminal careers, to stop them being criminal careers and to turn them onto decent lives. And we do that on a day-and-daily basis with the help of our staff. So is it something that you'd be willing to take away and have a look at, because it really is standing the way at justice being done? And thanks very much for your consideration.
Thanks for that. I would just say what you said has been heard by the two officials I've mentioned, and also Eric as well at the back. I have to be very careful getting involved in the court system for reasons that you'll understand. But the issue you raised, I think, is either one of resources or staffing or a combination of both. The one point I would make is that is not unusual these days. I'm not sure how long this will last, but in almost every sector you can imagine, the shortages of skilled individuals is a feature. It may change very abruptly very soon, but so they've heard what's been said, and for the two officials that work with the Scottish Government, if they can have a word with Eric and provide some information to me, I'm happy to look at that.
David Mackey. I'm a recently retired but still part-time sheriff. My question is really around the whole issue of access to justice. Thank you for your talk today, because you've highlighted a huge number of great things that are happening in Scotland, and there's a lot of good stuff happening in Scotland just now, and there's more. You didn't mention restorative justice, and there's a real head of steam rising behind restorative justice. But a question has arisen about I suppose, the fair division of the cake of justice. We've seen a huge investment in our court system, which is proving to be highly beneficial. A huge investment in the judiciary, with many new appointments, and the prosecution service. But while it's heartening for me to see that policymakers and the Scottish Government are recognising more and more that the vast majority of people who end up in the Sheriff Court, in particular, in terms of numbers, are there as a consequence of their life circumstances. There are many of the most vulnerable and underprivileged people, and you've mentioned all the issues of mental health, addiction, adverse childhood experiences, trauma. It isn't difficult to infer that those people are not in a position to afford or instruct their own legal services, and they are inevitably dependent on public support for that. This is not a plea on behalf of solicitors to improve their legal aid rates. I would suggest that it's a wider question about access to justice, and I think the plight of solicitors in the criminal defence service makes them more of a canary in the cage of our justice system, and their plight is something we should pay heed to, because as an ageing and diminishing number of hard-working solicitors are struggling with the same volume that the prosecution service and the court service are dealing with, I, as a sheriff, am seeing at first hand the problems that's causing in terms of access to justice. So the question is whether the Scottish Government is satisfied that it is investing as much as it can or should in supporting access to justice, or is there more that we can do in that front?
Thanks very much for your question, and thanks also for what I think, and I don't want to sound patronising, is a lifetime of commitment to the justice system that you yourself have made. It's well recognised, including amongst Scottish Government officials as well. Yeah, just to very quickly mention restorative justice, which I'm glad you've mentioned. I didn't, and it wasn't because of the fact, although it's true, that it's quite contentious, much more so than I realised, and just maybe spend a minute talking about that. So, there's a recent, well, a number of people have had a right go at me. It's a number of women's groups have had a go. However, I am no expert. I went to meet with a number of women who wanted to have restorative justice. And when I spoke to them about their personal, absolutely horrendous experiences, and one was an issue of incest, which was particularly difficult because the whole family dynamic, as you can imagine, had broken down. But these women were absolutely adamant. First of all, restorative justice does not change, and I know you know this, Sheriff Mackey, others might not know it. It doesn't change any sentence. It has no impact on the judicial process. Nobody is obliged to do it. It's only if the person that's been the victim of the crime wants to do it that it happens. I think the extent to which you said we'd be willing to see extended to sexual offences and rapes has given cause for some legitimate concern, mainly around the the ability for perpetrators to use coercive control. I mean, the one example given to me was of the guy in the court who, when his former partner was giving evidence at various points, coughed, and that cough was a warning to her, subtly, you know, that she was in trouble with him. And so people are very aware of the ability for perpetrators of crimes to use coercive control. However, these women were adamant they felt they would get something out of it, and it's done in other jurisdictions as well. So, it is, and it seems to be, in some cases, very effective for those that undergo it. On the access to justice, first of all, I think it's worth saying that in Scotland, legal aid, and it's not a cop-out, but this is dealt with by the minister that works with me, Ash Reagan, who's been dealing with it for a number of years before I came into office. Legal aid is not constrained in Scotland in terms of there's no budget which is set once it's expended, that's it. It's a demand-led budget which is not capped, and there's very few jurisdictions that I'm aware of that have that. However, I think the point that you're making, Sheriff Mackey, is availability and viability of defence solicitors in particular. There is an ongoing discussion which I know is problematic, and no, I'm not happy to answer your question that we've got that relationship resolved to the extent that we should have, but there are discussions going on, in particular this week, with the Law Society and others to try and see if we can get to a resolution in relation to this. And we've got no reason within the government to try and undermine criminal defence lawyers, for example. Why would we want to do that? So we do want to get the same thing. There have been, I think, a series of increases over recent years, but the point that defence lawyers are making is it's been underfunded for many years, and they want to see that compensated in a big change. However, there's an offer on the table and discussions are continuing, and I take the points that you've raised.
We're now starting to eat into your networking time, so apologies, but we'll just take one more question if I can. And I don't know, are you planning to stay around for?
Yep, a little bit longer.
Will you be happy to just take informal questions after the event?
Yeah, I've got to go into the 9 TV programme shortly after this, but for a while.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
Thank you, Minister. It was great to hear you speak tonight. I'm Ashley Cameron. I work for Families Outside. I'm Senior Policy and Public Affairs Officer. I just wanted to ask a question, and that is, what influence does the Scottish Government have over media reporting standards when it comes to crime? So that's the right to privacy, impact on others, often families left behind, who are innocent of any crime, and those accused of a crime who have complex learning disabilities and long-term mental health issues. Thank you.
I think the short answer is no controls whatsoever. And many people, I suppose, would be disturbed if we did have. I understand the point you make. So, for example, I mentioned before that we will seek in this session to bring forward legislation to ensure the anonymity of victims of rape and sexual assault. However, the reporting by newspapers, I'm not sure anybody's got real control over it, but to the extent it rests anywhere is with the UK government in terms of the media. We don't have that level of control. I think I've already hinted at the fact, very strongly hinted at the fact that the reporting of crime and justice seems to me to be quite one-sided amongst the bulk of the newspapers. And you know, sensationalist things are what sells newspapers. I do remember one of my local papers, which I'm sure Sheriff Mackey will remember as well, I'll not name it, who you could see a major change had taken place in this local newspaper, and I went to see the editor about it. They weren't covering what I thought were, who was I to say, but what I thought were important. She says, no, it's crime, that's what sells, and that's what we're going to cover. But I think, yeah, it's just common decency to look after people's privacy. As you say, the people involved are not guilty of any crime. They've not done anything that should provoke their privacy being breached. But I don't control that.
Thank you. I'm sorry there really isn't the time to take any further questions at the moment. I'd just like to thank you, Keith. The agenda that you laid out and the vision that's been laid out is huge. I mean, it's absolutely massive. There's so much in it which is promising and which is, I suppose, speaks into things that many of us who've been around for a long time in the sector have been looking for a long time. So there's this sort of sense of will it actually happen, I suppose. So I'm pleased that you've been able to offer not just a view and an overview of all the things which are sort of your priorities and are pressing at the moment, but I think we've also glimpsed a bit of the man behind the role, which is interesting, that there are areas that you are fundamentally caring about and interested in. So thank you for that. Thank you for offering that. For vision, to have space to become something which is workable. Sometimes, you know, crises get into the way of that, and it's easy for vision to get sort of sidelined a little bit in crisis. And the thing about crisis is, I suppose, that if we get through it, and we seem to get through it fairly well in many cases, but if we're going to get through this current situation, what we need is resilience. And we need it. We need resilience across organisations and across agencies as well. Insecurity is the enemy of resilience, and I'm just putting a personal plea in that the third sector is dependent on a fundamentally insecure business model. And change is good, and if it leads to better outcomes, of course it's good. But if it's dependent on what is essentially a market-led process, then it's never going to do or deliver on the vision that you've talked about, and which we actually are fundamentally behind. So I just leave that thought in and say thank you so much for giving this process. One of the comments that you made earlier on was that we all want a justice system that we can have faith in, and at a time when I suppose a lot of us have, faith has been stretched and trust has been stretched. I think that that would be echoed around this room, that we want a justice system which we can have faith in and we can believe in. So thank you. Thank you.
It's always good in some ways that we are left with questions, and I hope that people will continue the conversation when we move into the European room shortly for our networking event, because this is the beginning of a conversation, it's not the end of it, and hopefully you can stay for a short time to continue that. An event like this, there's always lots of people to thank, and it falls to me to give that formal thanks. I would like to thank you all for coming, particularly on such a particularly wild, it's not so wild now, and stormy evening. You'll have noticed that we have lost some numbers of participants, mainly due to the weather and also the adverse public transport situation, I believe, that was around. However, you'll be delighted to know that both for them and for yourselves, there will be a video and transcript of this lecture available on the website shortly, so you can come back and revisit what you've heard Keith say this evening and the questions. I'd also like to thank everybody in the Apex Scotland team, and particularly Lynn Hanna, who's out in the reception area there, who has done a tremendous amount of work to put on this evening. These things don't just happen, we all know that, and Lynn and the team have worked really, really hard to make this the event the success that it always is, so thank you to them. And thank you also to the staff of the City Chambers, who've also given us a lot of help in terms of setting up the room and making sure that all the things happen, and will, in terms of the event we were just about to go through, to the informal part of the evening, and to our IT and photography staff who've been doing the video and everything. So thanks to everybody who's been involved. So that brings it the end to the formal proceedings of tonight's annual lecture. We do hope that you will join us for the more informal part of the evening and the networking event, and maybe the chance to continue the conversation with our guest speaker. But thank you very much for coming, and I'll see you in the European room shortly, which if you go out here and turn right, I think, follow the signs, you'll find your way there. Thank you very much.